What if I told you that vampires are not just movie myths, but rather a belief that once terrorized entire villages and even mobilized governments? Today, you will discover terrifying accounts, historical evidence, and scientific explanations behind these dark creatures. Get ready for a journey between fear and truth. Since the dawn of humanity, stories of the dead returning to haunt the living have emerged in various cultures. The earliest records of vampire-like beings date back to Mesopotamia, where demonic creatures like Lilith were associated with death and blood consumption. These beliefs evolved and spread, taking on new forms as they merged with different mythologies over the centuries. In ancient Greece and Rome, legends mentioned beings known as striges, which attacked children at night and fed on their blood. These entities were described as spirits condemned to wander the earth, unable to find rest. However, it was in Eastern Europe that the concept of the vampire took its most recognizable form, feared as a reanimated corpse that rose from the grave to drain the life force of the living. The term vampire has Slavic roots, possibly derived from the word upir, meaning impure or evil spirit. During the 18th century, outbreaks of vampire hysteria plagued entire villages, fueling the belief that certain dead individuals were returning to torment their communities. Local authorities and even governments were forced to investigate reports of mysterious attacks and take drastic measures against the supposed vampires. The obsession with vampires was not merely the product of superstition, but rather an attempt to explain the unexplainable. Before modern science, exhumed bodies showing natural signs of decomposition were interpreted as proof of vampirism. This belief led to a series of practices aimed at preventing the dead from returning, many of which persisted for centuries. The terror of vampires was not limited to stories told around the fire. During the 17th and 18th centuries, various regions of Europe recorded outbreaks of mass hysteria, leading entire villages to exhume bodies and perform rituals to prevent the dead from returning. These events were documented by local authorities and even by governments, which faced the challenge of containing popular panic. The most notorious case occurred in Serbia with the soldier Arnold Paole. After his death, villagers began reporting sightings of his spirit and mysterious deaths among the population. When his grave was opened weeks later, his body was found intact with fresh blood in his mouth. The solution was brutal. A stake was driven through his chest, and his body was burned. The event was so significant that it spread across Europe, further increasing the fear of vampires. Reports of vampire attacks often coincided with periods of epidemics. Diseases such as tuberculosis and rabies, whose symptoms included extreme paleness, aversion to light, and aggressive behavior, were often interpreted as signs that someone was turning into a vampire. Without medical explanations, people believed that the only way to stop the plague was to eliminate the responsible individual. The belief in vampirism was so strong that it led to macabre preventive measures. Some of these practices included burying the dead with bricks in their mouths to prevent them from feeding, cutting off their heads, or piercing their hearts even before burial. Over time, as science advanced, these beliefs began to fade. But some of these traditions still persisted in isolated communities. For centuries, the belief in vampires was reinforced by the lack of knowledge about the natural processes of death. When corpses were exhumed for investigation, certain characteristics seemed to confirm suspicions that the dead had returned from the grave. However, today we know that these signs have plausible scientific explanations based on decomposition and misunderstood diseases of the time. For example, one of the most frightening phenomena was that upon opening graves, Some bodies appeared bloated, with blood seeping from their mouths. This was interpreted as a sign that the person had fed on the living after death. However, we now know that bloating is caused by the accumulation of gases during decomposition, and the apparent blood in the mouth is due to the rupture of internal organs. Another detail that reinforced the belief was the perception that nails and hair continue to grow after death. In reality, this occurs because the skin retracts as the body loses fluids, giving the illusion that these tissues are still lengthening. These small details, combined with the lack of medical understanding, made every tomb discovery a terrifying experience for the populations of the time. Additionally, some diseases were directly linked to the vampire myth. Rabies, for example, can cause extreme aggression, hypersensitivity to light and water, and muscle spasms that make the victim appear to be in a trance. Porphyria, a rare blood condition, can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight and skin deformities, leading some to believe that its sufferers were vampires. These medical misunderstandings help solidify the legend for generations. At the height of vampire hysteria, reports of the dead returning from their graves were not just legends told on cold nights. In various parts of Europe, governments began investigating the supposed occurrences, resulting in the first official records of vampire hunts. One of the most famous cases occurred in the 18th century in Serbia and involved Arnold Paole, a former soldier whose story became a milestone in vampire belief. Paole died under normal circumstances, but shortly after his burial, villagers began reporting sightings of his shadowy figure lurking around the village. Even more terrifying, several people fell ill and died without any apparent explanation. Fear spread quickly, and authorities decided to exhume his body. What they found only reinforced their suspicions. Paole appeared intact, with fresh blood on his lips. In a panic, the population followed traditional methods of eradicating vampirism. His body was impaled with a stake, burned, and his ashes scattered. However, the hysteria did not stop there. To ensure the outbreak ended, other corpses were also exhumed and subjected to the same ritual, including those who had died after Paole's supposed return. This episode triggered a wave of paranoia that rapidly spread to other regions. Official reports on the case were published and reached Austria, where scholars and doctors tried to understand the phenomenon. The press of the time took advantage of the scandal to spread even more fear of vampires. And belief in these creatures reached an unprecedented level. The case of Arnold Paole remains one of the most well-documented examples of mass hysteria caused by the vampire myth. The fear of vampires led to a series of rituals and protective methods that varied from region to region, but all had a common goal: to prevent the dead from returning to torment the living. These methods were not just superstition for the people of the time, they were a necessity to ensure the community's safety. The belief was so strong that even entire families participated in these macabre rituals. One of the most common practices was burying bodies with bricks or stones in their mouths. It was believed that by preventing the vampire from biting, it would be unable to drain the life force of the living. Another widely used technique was driving a wooden stake through the heart, usually made of oak or ash, as these trees were considered sacred. This method became the classic image of vampire destruction in popular culture. In some regions, bodies suspected of vampirism were decapitated and buried face down. This position symbolized that if the dead attempted to rise, they would only sink further into the earth. Additionally, decapitation was seen as a definitive measure, as it was believed that vampires needed their heads to see and locate their victims. In extreme cases, the corpse was completely burned, reducing it to ashes to prevent any chance of return. The use of garlic, crucifixes, and holy water also became common practice. Garlic, due to its strong fragrance, was considered a substance capable of repelling evil forces. Crucifixes and holy water, on the other hand, represented divine protection against creatures of darkness. These objects were often placed on doorways, graves, and even worn around people's necks as protective amulets. For centuries, the vampire was depicted as a grotesque creature, a bloated corpse that crawled out of the grave in search of victims. But everything changed in the 19th century when the myth was reshaped and given a new face, that of the seductive, immortal aristocrat. This transformation began with folklore stories and culminated in the iconic figure of Dracula, which redefined the concept of the vampire forever. The first major change occurred with the publication of The Vampire, 1819, by John Polidori. Inspired by the personality of the poet Lord Byron, the protagonist of the story, Lord Ruthven, was an enigmatic nobleman and social predator, vastly different from the bestial vampires of folklore. He charmed his victims with wit and intelligence before finally draining their lives. From this story, the image of the vampire began to shift from a monster to a sophisticated predator. But it was in 1897, with Dracula by Bram Stoker, that the transformation was fully realized. Inspired by Slavic legends and the history of Vlad the Impaler, Stoker created a vampire that combined horror and elegance. Count Dracula was an immortal being of noble origin who hypnotized his victims and drank their blood with sophistication. His presence in dark castles, his ability to transform into mist or a bat, and his power of seduction made him a literary and cinematic icon. From that moment on, the vampire was no longer just a monster. He was a symbol of mystery, desire, and power. Hollywood embraced this new vision, and the image of the vampire as a dark aristocrat was immortalized by actors such as Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, whose portrayals of Dracula helped cement this figure in popular culture. The vampire had evolved, and its presence would never be the same again. If books helped shape the modern myth of the vampire, it was cinema that solidified it as one of the most enduring icons of popular culture. Since the early days of the seventh art, vampires have been portrayed in different ways, evolving from repulsive monsters to seductive creatures and even anti-heroes. This cinematic journey reflects the fears and desires of each generation, constantly transforming the concept of the vampire. The first major milestone in vampire cinema was Nosferatu, 1922, a German film that presented a distorted and menacing version of Count Dracula. The character, named Count Orlok, had wide eyes, long fingers, and a cadaverous appearance that directly referenced ancient European myths. His grotesque look and eerie movements caused nightmares for an entire generation, solidifying the idea of the vampire as a monstrous and inescapable presence. By the 1930s, Dracula, 1931, starring Bela Lugosi, introduced the definitive image of the aristocratic vampire. With his black cape, piercing gaze, and hypnotic accent, Lugosi established the classic aesthetic of the seductive vampire, an alluring figure that combined danger and fascination. This model dominated the screens for decades, influencing generations of vampire films and series. Over the years, the vampire underwent various reinventions. In the 1980s, films like The Lost Boys, 1987, and Interview with the Vampire, 1994, introduced charismatic yet melancholic vampires, struggling with immortality as a curse. By the 21st century, with sagas like Twilight, 2008, and True Blood, Vampires were reimagined as symbols of romance and youthful desire, captivating a new generation of fans. From a cadaverous creature to a symbol of immortality and seduction, the vampire in cinema continues to evolve, reflecting the fears and fantasies of each era. But regardless of its appearance or behavior, its presence in popular culture is immortal, just like the creature itself. Vampires are more than just monsters. From haunted tales, they reflect humanity's deepest fears, obsessions, and desires. With each era, this creature adapts and resurfaces, shaped by society's anxieties and fantasies. But what explains the persistence of this myth? Why, even with all the advances in science, are we still fascinated by these beings of darkness? In the Middle Ages, vampires represented the terror of epidemics and sudden death. When entire villages were wiped out by mysterious diseases, the most terrifying yet logical explanation for the people was that undead beings were draining the life from the living. In the 19th century, the vampire came to symbolize deeper psychological fears, such as sexual repression and the threat of foreign forces infiltrating society, as seen in the figure of Dracula, a seductive and exotic being who terrified Victorian morality. In modern times, vampires have taken on new layers of meaning. In cinema and literature, they have become a mirror of contemporary anxieties, sometimes portrayed as cursed figures seeking redemption, other times as symbols of power, freedom, and forbidden desire. This duality makes the vampire continuously appealing to audiences, as it can be both the dark monster haunting our nightmares and the seductive icon that defies norms. And so, the vampire never disappears. It merely changes shape, adapting to the fears and dreams of each generation. As long as mysteries about death remain, as long as fear of the unknown persists, and as long as the desire for immortality lingers, vampires will continue to wander among us in the pages of books, on cinema screens, and perhaps somewhere closer than we imagine.